The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the High Court building in London. People walked quickly through the grand hallways, their footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. Lawyers carried heavy briefcases, judges wore their traditional wigs, and security guards stood at attention in their crisp uniforms. It was just another ordinary day in one of England's most important legal buildings. Sarah Mitchell held her 3-year-old daughter Emma's hand tightly as they entered the imposing courthouse. Sarah's heart was beating fast, not because she was in trouble, but because she was there as a witness in a very important case. She had seen something terrible happen 6 months ago, and today she would tell the court about it. But finding childcare had been impossible on such short notice, so little Emma had to come alone. Emma's big blue eyes looked around in wonder at the tall ceilings, the fancy decorations, and all the people dressed in black robes. She had never seen anything like this before. Her small hand gripped her mother's fingers as they walked through the security checkpoint. The metal detector beeped, and Emma giggled when the security guard smiled at her and waved a magic wand around her tiny body. "Mummy, why is everyone wearing funny clothes?" Emma whispered in her sweet little voice. Sarah bent down to Emma's level and spoke softly. "They're wearing special clothes for work, sweetheart. Just like how Daddy wears his uniform when he goes to work at the fire station." The case Sarah was testifying in was about a serious crime that had happened near her home. She had been walking Emma to the playground when she witnessed a hit-and-run accident. A young mother had been crossing the street with her baby when a car hit her and drove away without stopping. Sarah was the only person who had seen the driver's face clearly, and her testimony could help put the guilty person in prison. As they made their way to courtroom number 7, Emma kept looking at everything with curiosity. The walls were covered with portraits of important judges from long ago. Their serious faces looked down at everyone passing by. Emma pointed at one particularly stern-looking man in an old painting. "He looks grumpy, Mummy," she said loudly enough for several people to hear. A few lawyers smiled despite the serious atmosphere. Children had a way of seeing things simply and honestly. Sarah felt embarrassed but also proud of her daughter's innocent observations. They reached the courtroom, and Sarah spoke with the prosecutor, Mrs. Henderson, who would be asking her questions. Mrs. Henderson was a kind woman in her 50s who had been working as a lawyer for over 20 years. She understood how difficult it could be for witnesses, especially when they had to bring their children to court. "I'm so sorry you had to bring Emma," Mrs. Henderson said apologetically. "I know this isn't an ideal situation." Sarah shook her head. "It's okay. My babysitter got sick this morning, and my husband couldn't take time off work. Emma's usually very well behaved. She'll just sit quietly while I testify." Mrs. Henderson looked down at Emma, who was now fascinated by a large clock on the wall. The little girl was counting the numbers she could recognize, pointing at each one with her tiny finger. 1, 2, 3, she counted proudly. "She seems like a bright little girl," Mrs. Henderson observed. "She is," Sarah replied with a smile. "She notices everything and remembers things that even adults forget. Sometimes I'm amazed by what she picks up on." The courtroom was slowly filling with people. The defendant, Mr. Robert Collins, sat with his defense lawyer at one table. He was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit who kept checking his watch nervously. This was the man Sarah had seen driving the car that hit the young mother. The victim, thankfully, had survived but was still recovering from serious injuries. Judge Williams entered the courtroom, and everyone stood up respectfully. He was an experienced judge who had been handling serious criminal cases for 15 years. He noticed the little girl immediately but said nothing. It wasn't unusual for witnesses to bring family members when necessary. Emma sat on a chair next to where her mother would be testifying. She had brought her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy, and a small coloring book to keep her busy. Sarah had explained that she needed to be very quiet while Mummy talked to the important people in the fancy room. The morning proceeded with opening statements and preliminary witnesses. Emma was surprisingly good, coloring quietly and whispering to her stuffed rabbit. Occasionally, she would look up and observe the proceedings with the intense focus that only young children possess. She watched the lawyers walking around, the judge writing notes, and the people in the audience. During a brief recess, Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why is that man sad?" she asked, pointing toward the defendant. Sarah looked at Mr. Collins, who did indeed appear troubled. His lawyer was speaking to him in hushed tones, and his face showed clear signs of stress and worry. "Sometimes adults have problems they need to solve," Sarah explained carefully. "That's why we're all here today, to help solve a problem." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. In her simple understanding, adults were always solving problems. When toys broke, adults fixed them. When she fell down, adults made it better. It seemed natural that there would be a special room where adults came to solve bigger problems. When court resumed, it was Sarah's turn to testify. She kissed Emma on the forehead and reminded her to be good. Emma promised she would color quietly and not make any noise. As Sarah walked to the witness stand, Emma watched proudly. Her mummy was going to help solve the grown-ups' problem. Mrs. Henderson began asking Sarah questions about what she had witnessed that day 6 months ago. Sarah spoke clearly and honestly about seeing the accident, describing the car, the time of day, and, most importantly, getting a clear look at the driver's face when he had stopped briefly before driving away. "Can you point out the person you saw driving the car?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Sarah looked directly at Mr. Collins and pointed. "That man, sitting at the table with the other lawyer." The defense attorney objected to several questions, claiming they were leading or irrelevant. Judge Williams sustained some objections and overruled others. The legal proceedings continued with the formal language and procedures that make courts work properly. Emma continued coloring, but she was also listening in her own way. She might not understand all the big words, but she could sense the emotions in the room. Her mother seemed nervous but determined. The sad man looked even sadder. The people in black robes seemed very serious about everything. During Sarah's testimony about the exact time of the accident, Emma suddenly looked up from her coloring book. Something had caught her attention, but it wasn't clear what. She tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to remember something important. The morning session ended with Sarah still on the witness stand. Judge Williams announced they would break for lunch and resume in 90 minutes. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Emma gathered her coloring supplies and put Mr. Hoppy safely in her small backpack. "You did great, sweetheart," Sarah told her daughter as they left the courthouse for lunch. "Thank you for being so good and quiet." Emma smiled up at her mother. "Mummy, you were very brave talking to all those people." They found a small cafe near the courthouse that served simple lunches. Emma ordered chicken nuggets and apple juice while Sarah tried to eat a sandwich despite her nervous stomach. She was relieved that the morning had gone well and that Emma had behaved perfectly. "Do we have to go back to the fancy room?" Emma asked between bites of chicken. "Yes, for a little while longer," Sarah explained. "Then, we can go home and pick up Daddy from work." Emma nodded and continued eating. She was already looking forward to telling her father about the big room with all the serious people and the portraits of grumpy men on the walls. As they walked back to the courthouse after lunch, neither Sarah nor Emma could have predicted what would happen in the next few hours. Emma had been observing everything with the sharp eyes of a curious child, storing away details that adults might miss. Soon, those observations would prove to be more important than anyone could have imagined. The afternoon session was about to begin, and the truth was about to come out in a way no one expected. After lunch, Sarah and Emma returned to the courthouse feeling refreshed. Emma had enjoyed her chicken nuggets and was now more comfortable with the surroundings. The big building didn't seem quite as scary anymore, and she had started to recognize some of the people walking around in their formal clothes. As they settled back into courtroom number 7, Emma noticed something different. There were more people in the audience now, including some men in very special uniforms she hadn't seen before. These weren't regular security guards like the ones at the entrance. These men wore bright red jackets with shiny gold buttons, tall black hats, and carried themselves with perfect posture. "Mummy, look at the pretty soldiers," Emma whispered, pointing discreetly at the uniformed men. Sarah glanced over and realized these were ceremonial guards who sometimes provided security for high-profile court cases. Their presence suggested this case was more important than she had initially understood. The red-coated guards stood at attention near the back of the courtroom, their faces expressionless and professional. "Those are special guards, sweetheart," Sarah whispered back. "They're here to make sure everyone stays safe." Emma stared at the guards with fascination. She had never seen uniforms so colorful and formal. The bright red wool coats were decorated with intricate gold braiding, and their tall black bearskin hats made them look like characters from one of her storybooks. They looked exactly like the toy soldiers she had seen in the Christmas display at the department store. Judge Williams called the court back to order, and Sarah returned to the witness stand to continue her testimony. The defense attorney began his cross-examination, trying to poke holes in Sarah's memory of the events. He asked detailed questions about the lighting conditions, the distance she was standing from the accident, and whether she might have been distracted by caring for her young daughter. "Mrs. Mitchell, you stated that you got a clear look at the driver's face," the defense attorney said. "But weren't you primarily focused on your daughter's safety during this chaotic moment?" Sarah answered confidently. "I was holding Emma's hand, and we were waiting at the crosswalk. When the accident happened, my first instinct was to make sure Emma was safe, but I definitely saw the driver's face when he stopped and looked back before driving away." "And how long would you say you observed the driver?" "Probably 3 or 4 seconds, Sarah replied. "Long enough to see his face clearly and remember it." The defense attorney continued pressing, suggesting that 3 seconds wasn't enough time to make a reliable identification, especially during a traumatic event. He questioned whether the distance, the angle of view, and the emotional stress of witnessing an accident might have affected Sarah's perception. While this was happening, Emma was dividing her attention between her coloring book and watching the people in the courtroom. She was particularly fascinated by the royal guards, who stood so still they looked like statues. She wondered if they ever got tired of standing so straight and serious. During the testimony, something strange began to happen. Emma started looking back and forth between her mother on the witness stand and one of the royal guards near the back wall. She tilted her head to one side, then the other, as if she was comparing two pictures. Her small face showed the concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Sarah continued answering questions about the accident. She described the car in detail, a dark blue sedan with a dented front bumper and a scratch along the passenger side. She explained how the driver had looked directly at her for a moment before speeding away, giving her a clear view of his face. He had dark hair, brown eyes, and a small scar near his left temple, Sarah testified. "I remember thinking he looked panicked and guilty." The defense attorney objected to Sarah's interpretation of the driver's emotional state, arguing that she couldn't know what someone was thinking just by looking at them. Judge Williams sustained the objection and instructed the jury to disregard Sarah's opinion about the driver's mental state. Meanwhile, Emma had put down her crayons and was now staring intently at one particular royal guard. This guard was standing along the wall, about 15 feet away from where Emma was sitting. He was a tall man with the same dark hair and brown eyes that Sarah had described. Like all the guards, he maintained perfect military bearing, looking straight ahead without any facial expression. But Emma's sharp 3-year-old eyes had noticed something that all the adults in the room had missed. As she studied the guard's profile, she could see a small mark near his left temple, partially hidden by the shadow of his tall hat. It was exactly where her mother had said the bad driver had a scar. Emma's heart began beating faster with the excitement of discovery. She felt like she was playing a game of hide and seek and had found someone who was supposed to be hiding. She looked at her mother, then back at the guard, then at her mother again. The resemblance was impossible to ignore once she had noticed it. Children have a special gift for recognizing faces and patterns. Their minds aren't cluttered with adult assumptions and distractions. Emma saw what she saw with perfect clarity. The guard looked exactly like the person her mother was describing as the bad driver. She raised her small hand and tugged gently on the sleeve of the court clerk who was sitting nearby. The clerk, Mrs. Peterson, was a kindly woman in her 60s who had worked in the courthouse for many years. She leaned down to hear what the little girl wanted to say. The soldier looks like the bad man, Emma whispered, pointing toward the royal guard. Mrs. Peterson followed Emma's pointing finger and saw she was indicating one of the ceremonial guards. The clerk smiled politely, assuming the child was just making an innocent observation or playing pretend. "That's nice, dear," Mrs. Peterson whispered back. "Please keep coloring quietly while your mummy talks." But Emma was persistent. In her mind, this was very important information that the grown-ups needed to know. She had been listening to her mother talk about the bad driver, and now she could see him standing right there in the room. Why wasn't anyone else noticing this? Emma tried again, this time tugging on the sleeve of a lawyer who was sitting in the front row. She pointed again at the same royal guard and whispered more urgently, "That man. That's the bad driver man." The lawyer glanced where she was pointing, saw nothing unusual, and gently patted Emma's head before turning his attention back to the proceedings. Like the court clerk, he assumed she was just playing or had gotten confused about something. Growing frustrated that none of the adults were listening to her important discovery, Emma stood up on her chair to get a better view. She looked at her mother, who was still answering questions about the accident, then looked at the royal guard again. There was no doubt in her mind they were talking about that man right there. Sarah was describing the moment when the driver had looked at her after the accident. "He stared directly at me for several seconds before driving away. I could see the fear and guilt in his eyes. It was as if he realized someone had witnessed what he had done." As Sarah spoke these words, something remarkable happened. The royal guard she was unknowingly describing shifted slightly. It was barely noticeable, just a small tightening around his eyes and a nearly imperceptible change in his breathing. But Emma, who had been watching him intently, saw the reaction immediately. The guard's military training had taught him to remain motionless and expressionless under all circumstances. However, hearing a detailed description of his own face and actions from that terrible day 6 months ago was causing him to struggle with maintaining his composure. Emma's excitement grew as she realized the soldier was reacting to her mother's words. This confirmed what she already knew: he was definitely the bad man they were all talking about. She needed to tell someone right away, but none of the adults would listen to her. The prosecution continued with Sarah's testimony, asking her to describe the exact sequence of events. Sarah explained how she had immediately called the police from her cell phone and had given them a detailed description of the driver and the car. She had also provided the partial license plate number she had managed to see. "The police arrived within 5 minutes, Sarah continued. "I told them everything I had observed, and they took my contact information for follow-up. I never heard anything more until I was contacted to testify in this trial." The defense attorney resumed his cross-examination, suggesting that Sarah's memory might have changed over the 6 months since the accident. He argued that human memory was unreliable and could be influenced by photographs, news reports, and discussions with other people. During this exchange, Emma made a decision. She had tried whispering to the grown-ups, but they weren't paying attention. She needed to do something bigger to make them understand. With the determination that only a 3-year-old possesses when they know they're right about something important, Emma climbed down from her chair and began walking toward the front of the courtroom. Sarah noticed her daughter moving and felt a moment of panic. "Emma, come back here," she said quietly but urgently from the witness stand. But Emma was on a mission. She walked with purpose toward the center of the courtroom, her small shoes making tiny clicking sounds on the marble floor. Everyone began to notice the little girl walking confidently through the formal legal proceedings. Judge Williams looked up from his notes and saw Emma approaching the front of the courtroom. He had been a judge long enough to know that when a 3-year-old was determined to do something, it was usually better to find out what they wanted rather than try to stop them. "Young lady," Judge Williams said gently, "what seems to be the matter?" Emma stopped in the center of the courtroom and turned to face the judge. Then, with perfect clarity and absolute confidence, she raised her small arm and pointed directly at the royal guard who had been struggling to maintain his composure. The entire courtroom turned to follow her pointing finger. Lawyers, jury members, the defendant, court officials, and spectators all looked toward the back wall where the ceremonial guards were stationed. In the sudden silence that followed, Emma spoke 2 words that would change everything. "That's him," she said in her clear, innocent voice. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Every person present turned to look at the royal guard Emma was pointing at with such certainty. The guard, whose name was James Worthington, felt his heart hammering against his chest as dozens of pairs of eyes suddenly focused on him. Judge Williams looked from Emma to the guard and back again. In his 15 years on the bench, he had seen many unexpected moments, but never anything quite like this. A 3-year-old child had just interrupted formal legal proceedings to make an accusation that seemed impossible. "I'm sorry, young lady," Judge Williams said kindly but firmly, "but I think you might be confused. That gentleman is a royal guard providing security for this courtroom." Emma shook her head vigorously, her blonde curls bouncing. She kept her small finger pointed steadily at Guard Worthington. "No. That's the bad driver man that hurt the lady. Mummy saw him." Sarah felt her face turn red with embarrassment. She started to get up from the witness stand to collect her daughter and apologize for the disruption. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor. She's just 3 years old and doesn't understand," but, as Sarah looked at the guard her daughter was pointing to, something made her pause. Even from across the courtroom, something about his profile seemed familiar. The dark hair, the height, the way he held himself, there was something that triggered a memory from that terrible day 6 months ago. Defense attorney Martin Reynolds was the first to speak up. "Your Honor, this is clearly a disruptive child who doesn't understand the seriousness of these proceedings. I request that the child be removed from the courtroom immediately." However, prosecutor Mrs. Henderson had worked with enough witnesses to know that children sometimes notice things adults miss. She had also observed that the guard in question seemed unusually tense for someone who should be accustomed to courtroom formalities. "Your Honor," Mrs. Henderson said thoughtfully, "perhaps we should address this situation properly before dismissing it entirely. The child seems quite certain about her identification." Judge Williams considered the unprecedented situation. Part of him wanted to have Emma quietly escorted out so the trial could continue normally. But another part of him, the part that had learned to trust his instincts over years of legal experience, felt that something significant was happening. Guard James Worthington stood frozen in place, his military training warring with his growing panic. He had thought he was safe. The police investigation had gone nowhere because no one had been able to identify him. The car he had been driving that day belonged to his girlfriend, and he had managed to get it repaired quickly at a small garage that asked no questions. For 6 months, he had lived with the guilt of what he had done. He knew he should have stopped to help the woman he had hit, but fear had overwhelmed him. He had been running late for an important job interview, driving too fast on a street he didn't know well. When the woman had stepped into the crosswalk with her baby, he had hit the brakes but couldn't stop in time. The impact had been minor, and, through his rearview mirror, he had seen the woman get up quickly. She seemed more shaken than hurt, and her baby appeared unharmed. But, instead of stopping to check on them and call for help, he had panicked and driven away. By the time he realized what a terrible mistake he had made, it was too late to go back. He had followed the news coverage obsessively, relieved to learn that both the mother and baby had suffered only minor injuries. But he also knew that his hit and run was still a serious crime. He could lose his job with the Royal Guard, face criminal charges, and have his life destroyed. Now, as he stood in the courtroom where an innocent man was being tried for his crime, a 3-year-old child had somehow recognized him. The irony was overwhelming. He had volunteered for this security assignment because he thought it would be impossible for anyone to connect him to the case while he was wearing his official uniform. Emma remained standing in the center of the courtroom, her finger still pointing at Guard Worthington. She was getting frustrated that the adults weren't understanding what seemed so obvious to her. "Look at his face," she said more loudly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He has the same hurt on his head that Mummy said." Sarah squinted across the courtroom, trying to see what Emma was talking about. The guard's hat cast a shadow across part of his face, making it difficult to see clearly. But there was definitely something about his overall appearance that seemed familiar. Mrs. Henderson approached Judge Williams. "Your Honor, I believe this warrants closer examination. If the witness recognizes someone in this courtroom as the perpetrator, we have an obligation to investigate, regardless of how unlikely it might seem." Defense attorney Reynolds objected strongly. This is absurd. Are we really going to interrupt a serious criminal trial because a toddler thinks she recognizes someone? This could be prejudicial to my client's case and highly disruptive to courtroom order. Judge Williams raised his hand for silence. He looked at Emma, who was still standing patiently in the center of the room, then at the guard she was pointing to. Something in the guard's posture had changed. The perfect military bearing was still there, but there was a tension that hadn't been present earlier. "Guard Worthington," Judge Williams said formally, "would you please step forward?" James Worthington felt his legs go weak. This was the moment he had dreaded for months. He had no choice but to comply with the judge's request. Slowly, he began walking from his position along the wall toward the front of the courtroom. As he moved closer, Sarah got her first clear look at his face. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Even with the formal uniform and military bearing, she could see it clearly now. This was definitely the man who had hit the woman and driven away. The same dark eyes, the same facial structure, and, yes, there was a small scar near his left temple, exactly where she remembered it. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "See? I told you it was him." Guard Worthington reached the front of the courtroom and stood at attention, his training keeping him upright despite the chaos in his mind. He looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone, but his face had gone pale beneath his tan. Mrs. Henderson studied his face carefully, comparing what she saw to the description Sarah had given in her testimony. The resemblance to the description was unmistakable. She turned to address Judge Williams. "Your Honor, I believe we need to examine this situation more thoroughly. The witness has made a positive identification of someone in this courtroom as the actual perpetrator of the crime." The defendant, Mr. Robert Collins, who had been sitting quietly throughout this extraordinary development, suddenly understood what was happening. For months, he had maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been wrongfully accused. Now it appeared that a 3-year-old child might have found the real culprit. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell everyone," Mr. Collins said, standing up despite his lawyer's attempts to quiet him. "I wasn't even in that part of town when the accident happened." Judge Williams called for order as the courtroom began buzzing with excited whispers. This case had just taken a turn that no one could have predicted. He needed to handle the situation carefully to ensure that justice was served while maintaining proper legal procedures. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Reynolds," Judge Williams said, "I'm calling a recess so we can address this development appropriately. Guard Worthington, you will remain available for questioning. Court officers, please ensure that all relevant parties stay in the building." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Emma walked back to her mother with a satisfied expression. She had successfully gotten the adults to pay attention to her important discovery. In her simple understanding, she had helped solve the grown-ups' problem, just like she had hoped to do. Sarah knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "Emma, sweetheart, how did you know that was the same person?" Emma shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "He looked the same as when you told the story about the bad driver. And, when you talked about his hurt," she pointed to her own temple, "his face got scared, just like when Mr. Hoppy knows he did something wrong." Adults sometimes forget that children see the world with remarkable clarity, unfiltered by the assumptions and limitations that come with experience. Emma had observed and remembered details that trained legal professionals had missed. Her innocent honesty had cut through all the complexity and confusion to reveal the truth. During the recess, police officers were called to question Guard Worthington. Mrs. Henderson spoke with Sarah about the identification, while defense attorney Reynolds conferred urgently with his client about this unexpected development. Guard Worthington sat in a small conference room, no longer able to maintain his military composure. The weight of 6 months of guilt, combined with the shock of being exposed by a 3-year-old child, had finally broken down his defenses. "I never meant for an innocent man to be charged," he said quietly to the detective who was questioning him. "When I realized someone else had been arrested for what I did, I wanted to come forward, but I was too scared." The truth was finally coming out, all because an observant little girl had trusted what she saw and refused to be ignored. The real question now was what would happen next, and how this revelation would change the lives of everyone involved in this extraordinary case. In the small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Detective Inspector Sarah Hughes sat across from James Worthington, who was no longer wearing his Royal Guard uniform. The bright red coat and tall black hat that had hidden his identity for months now hung on a chair nearby, looking like costumes from a play that had ended badly. "Tell me what really happened that day, James," Detective Hughes said gently but firmly. She had been investigating hit-and-run cases for 8 years and had seen many people struggle with guilt and fear after making terrible decisions. James stared at his hands, which were shaking slightly. For 6 months, he had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, knowing that someday he might have to confess. He just never imagined it would happen because a 3-year-old child would recognize him in a crowded courtroom. It was February 15th, he began slowly. "I had an interview for a promotion within the Royal Guard service. I was running late because my usual route was blocked by construction. I took a detour through residential streets I didn't know well." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I was driving my girlfriend's car because mine was in the shop. I was stressed about being late and driving faster than I should have. When I reached the intersection near the playground, I saw the crosswalk light was green for pedestrians." Detective Hughes took notes while listening carefully. She had read the case file and knew that the victim, Maria Santos, had been crossing with her 8-month-old baby when she was hit. "The woman appeared suddenly," James continued. "I mean, she wasn't doing anything wrong, she had the right of way. But I was looking at my GPS and didn't see her until the last second. I hit the brakes hard, but the car still struck her." "What happened immediately after the impact?" James closed his eyes, reliving the moment he had tried to forget. "She fell down, but she got back up quickly. The baby was crying but seemed unhurt. I sat there for maybe 10 seconds, knowing I should get out and help her. But then, I panicked. I thought about my career, my future, everything I would lose if I was charged with reckless driving." "So you decided to leave the scene?" "I looked around to see if anyone had witnessed what happened. That's when I saw the woman with the little girl standing at the corner." James looked up at Detective Hughes. "She was staring right at me. I could tell she had seen everything. For a moment, we just looked at each other, and I think she could see the guilt and fear on my face." "Why didn't you stop and face the consequences then?" James struggled to find words that could explain his cowardice. "I told myself that the woman who was hit seemed okay, that maybe it wasn't as serious as it looked. I convinced myself that leaving wouldn't really hurt anyone. I drove away telling myself I would come back, but I never did." "What did you do after you left the scene?" "I drove straight home and called in sick to work, claiming I had food poisoning. I was too shaken to think clearly. I watched the news constantly for reports about the accident. When I learned that the woman and baby had only minor injuries, I felt relieved but also more guilty." Detective Hughes had heard similar stories many times. Fear and panic could make people act in ways they never thought possible. "When did you learn that someone else had been charged for the crime?" "About 2 weeks later," James replied, his voice breaking. "I saw a news report that they had arrested a man named Robert Collins. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to come forward then, but I was paralyzed by fear. Every day that passed made it harder to confess because it meant admitting I had let an innocent man suffer for my actions." "Why did you volunteer for security duty at this trial?" James shook his head at his own poor judgment. "I thought it would help me understand what was happening with the case. I also believed that no one would ever recognize me while I was in uniform. I was completely wrong on both counts." Meanwhile, in the main courtroom, Emma was coloring again while the adults around her discussed the implications of her identification. She had returned to her simple activity, satisfied that she had helped solve the problem. Mr. Hoppy, her stuffed rabbit, sat next to her as she carefully stayed within the lines of a picture of a butterfly. Sarah sat nearby, still amazed by what her daughter had accomplished. "I can't believe she recognized him," she told Mrs. Henderson. "I mean, I'm the one who saw him that day, but even I didn't notice the resemblance until she pointed it out." Mrs. Henderson had prosecuted hundreds of cases and had never seen anything like this. Children see things differently than adults do, she explained. They notice details and patterns without all the assumptions and distractions that adults have. Your daughter's observation might just save an innocent man from prison. Mr. Robert Collins sat with his lawyer, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. For months, he had maintained his innocence while watching evidence pile up against him. His alibi for the time of the accident had been weak. He had been driving in the same general area, returning from a doctor's appointment, but had no way to prove his exact whereabouts at the crucial moment. I knew I didn't do it, he told his lawyer, but I was starting to worry that the jury might convict me anyway. I can't thank that little girl enough for speaking up. His defense attorney, Martin Reynolds, was reviewing the implications of this development. We'll need to verify everything, of course, but if this guard confesses to the crime, all charges against you should be dropped immediately. In another conference room, the victim of the hit-and-run accident, Maria Santos, sat with her lawyer and victim's advocate. She had recovered well from her injuries, and her baby son Diego was healthy and happy. She had been prepared to face the man she thought had hit her and driven away, but this new development had surprised her as much as everyone else. I just want justice, Maria said quietly. It doesn't matter to me who is held responsible, as long as it's the right person. If this guard is the one who hit me, then I'm glad the truth is finally coming out. Her lawyer explained that the case would likely be resolved quickly now that they had the real perpetrator. The important thing is that you and Diego are safe and healthy, and that whoever did this takes responsibility for their actions. Back in the interrogation room, James Worthington was providing a full confession to Detective Hughes. He gave detailed information about the car he had been driving, the damage it had sustained, and where he had taken it for repairs. He also explained how he had hidden his involvement in the accident from his colleagues and superiors in the Royal Guard. I want to make this right, James said finally. I know I can't undo what I did, or take back the months of suffering I caused Mr. Collins and his family. But I want to take full responsibility now. Detective Hughes closed her notebook and looked at James seriously. You'll be charged with leaving the scene of an accident, reckless driving, and potentially interfering with a criminal investigation by allowing someone else to be charged for your crime. You'll also likely face disciplinary action from your employer. James nodded, understanding that his career as a Royal Guard was over. I accept whatever consequences come from this. I should have faced them 6 months ago. 2 hours later, Judge Williams reconvened the court to address the extraordinary developments. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and court officials who had heard about the case where a 3-year-old child had identified the real perpetrator during someone else's trial. Emma sat in her chair, unaware that her simple act of honesty had attracted so much attention. She was focused on a new coloring page featuring a castle with tall towers, which seemed appropriate given the day's events involving royal guards and courtroom drama. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Williams announced, based on new evidence that has come to light during these proceedings, the charges against Mr. Robert Collins are being dismissed immediately. The courtroom erupted in applause as Mr. Collins stood up, tears streaming down his face. His family, who had been sitting in the back row throughout the trial, rushed forward to embrace him. His wife had never doubted his innocence, but the stress of the trial had taken a toll on their entire family. Judge Williams continued, Mr. James Worthington has confessed to being the actual perpetrator of the hit-and-run incident in question. He will be processed according to the law and face appropriate charges for his actions. Mrs. Henderson stood to address the court. Your Honor, I want to acknowledge that this resolution was only possible because of the remarkable observation and courage of a 3-year-old witness. Emma Mitchell's willingness to speak up about what she saw has prevented a serious miscarriage of justice. Emma looked up from her coloring when she heard her name mentioned. She wasn't entirely sure what the adults were talking about, but everyone seemed happy, which made her happy too. She waved at the people who were smiling at her, then returned to coloring her castle. Sarah felt overwhelmed with pride for her daughter and relief that justice was being served. Emma, you did something very important today, she whispered to her daughter. You helped make sure the right person was held responsible for what they did wrong. Emma nodded seriously. I know, Mummy. The soldier man was sad because he knew he did something bad. Just like when I break something and feel sad about it. In her simple way, Emma had understood something that all the adults had missed. She had recognized the expression of guilt and fear on James Worthington's face when her mother described the accident. Children are natural lie detectors because they haven't yet learned to ignore their instincts about people's emotions and behaviors. As the courtroom began to empty, several news reporters approached Sarah, hoping to interview her about Emma's remarkable identification. Sarah politely declined, wanting to protect her daughter's privacy and return to their normal life. "We just want to go home," Sarah told the reporters. Emma did what any honest child would do. She told the truth about what she saw. "I'm proud of her, but I also want her to have a normal childhood away from all this attention." The case made headlines in newspapers and television news programs across the country. 3-year-old solves hit-and-run case and child's honesty saves innocent man were typical of the stories that ran for several days after the trial. Legal experts used the case as an example of why eyewitness testimony, especially from children, should be taken seriously. Child psychologists explained how young children often make better witnesses than adults because they observe without prejudice and say exactly what they see. 3 weeks later, James Worthington pleaded guilty to all charges against him. He received a 2-year suspended sentence, community service, and was required to pay restitution to Maria Santos for her medical expenses and lost wages. He also lost his position as a royal guard and was barred from similar security work in the future. In his statement to the court, James expressed deep remorse for his actions and gratitude that the truth had finally been revealed. "I want to thank the little girl who had the courage to point me out when I couldn't find the courage to confess myself. Her honesty saved an innocent man and allowed me to finally face the consequences of my actions." Robert Collins and his family worked to rebuild their lives after the charges were dropped. The months of stress and uncertainty had been difficult, but they were grateful for the truth and for Emma's intervention. Mr. Collins sent a thank you card to Emma with a picture of a rainbow and the words "Thank you for helping me." Emma kept the card on her bedroom wall next to her drawings and pictures. She didn't fully understand all the implications of what she had done, but she knew she had helped someone, which made her feel good. Maria Santos recovered completely from her injuries, and her baby Diego grew into a happy, healthy toddler. She met with Emma and Sarah several months later to thank them personally for ensuring that justice was served. Emma was delighted to meet Diego and immediately wanted to share her toys with him. The case became part of legal history, studied in law schools as an example of how unexpected witnesses and testimony can change the course of justice. But, for Emma, it was just the day she helped solve a grown-up problem by telling the truth about what she saw. Years later, when Emma was old enough to understand the full significance of what had happened that day in court, she would learn that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply be honest about what they observe, regardless of how unlikely or impossible it might seem to others. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people have the courage to speak it, even when that courage comes from someone too young to understand fear, politics, or the complicated ways that adults sometimes avoid facing reality. Emma's innocent honesty had set multiple people free: an innocent man from wrongful conviction, a guilty man from the burden of his secret, and a victim from uncertainty about whether justice would ever be served. In the end, it was a perfect reminder that truth and justice don't always come from complex legal procedures or sophisticated investigations. Sometimes they come from the clear eyes and honest voice of a child who simply says what she sees.